Maybe we should begin. So, good evening and welcome to this session of the cooperation between CEPS and CDP. It is the fourth event in this series, and it has the objective to seek interaction with stakeholders on topics of EU initiatives that impact on the national level and have an effect of the role of the national promotional institutions. Today we have a very important topic and a very difficult topic, the open strategic autonomy. It is also a changing topic, and as even the casual newspaper reader will notice, it looks like a moving target. So it will be a very interesting discussion tonight. After my welcoming remarks, we will hear 15 minutes speech of Uti, and then there will be afterwards a panel discussion for 20 minutes. You must be very disappointed not to see Andrea Render. His son has fallen ill, and I'm happy to step in for him tonight. So with this, I give the word to Uti for her speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here to speak about open strategic autonomy. When we talk about open strategic autonomy, we are very much talking about risk assessment and risk management. This, of course, is something which has existed for a long time. This is what all companies do. This is what governments do. But now, after the pandemic, after the brutal Russian aggression in Ukraine, and facing climate change, if anything, risk management has become more topical than ever. In my intervention, I wanted to start by presenting some of the results of the analytical work that we have done to assess supply chain risks for the Commission. As you have seen, I work in the Directorate General for Industry, Internal Market, Entrepreneurship and SMEs. I'm working with companies assessing the business environment risks, and in this case supply chain risks is a core part of our work. After presenting some of our results, I want to say some things about the Commission's actions to address supply chain risks and also economic security topics in general. The Commission issued last week a new policy proposal on economic security, and it's probably more topical than some of the other issues which have now been there for several months. So I will say some words about that. And of course, I wanted to conclude by saying some words about the importance of the single market and safeguarding the functioning of the single market in all this. So starting with our analysis, we have looked at trade data. Our chief economist and his team looked at EU imports in goods with the aim of identifying whether there are imports which are particularly strategic and which include risks for us. Starting with thousands and thousands of product categories, the first choice we made was to decide what counts as strategic, because otherwise you end up with a lot of products like garden furniture and Christmas lights, and possibly in a crisis we could even live without them. So the first selection was to look at security-related, safety-related imports, anything that is health-related, and then finally looking at things which are critical for our green and digital transition. One obvious question is maybe why we didn't look at food or agri-food in general. We didn't look at it. The Commission, our colleagues, are designing measures for food crisis. We, however, identified some types of fertilizers in our analysis. But then looking at these sectors or what we import in these areas, we applied 3 criteria. First, we selected only those products where everything that is imported into the EU from the outside comes from only one single country or 2 countries. So therefore imposing a critical dependence. And we saw in the pandemic when suddenly supplies from China came to an abrupt halt, we saw very concretely what it can mean if suddenly one producer is not in the supply chain. Secondly, we only took products where the data show that foreign imports are the most significant part of EU demand as a whole. So if imports are marginal compared to domestic production, this doesn't count as a strategic dependence. And thirdly, we also looked at whether there are substitutes in the EU available. And then we ended up with a list of about 200 products. We have done an earlier paper 2 years ago where the list was a bit short. Now we have identified a few more products due to the refinements in the methodology and slightly different choices, but this is still a list which policymakers can look at. And then looking at what we ended up in terms of the product categories or industries. Within the energy intensive sectors, there is a very long list of raw materials: manganese, nickel, aluminium, chromium, rare earth metals, molybdenum, borates, uranium, silicon, and permanent magnets. Also, more traditional energy sources, coal, petroleum, coke, some gases, are still among our critical dependencies. Within the health ecosystem, as we call it, this was the second most important category. A lot of medicines, vitamins, inputs into medicine, but also medical instruments. And as everybody knows by now, COVID-related products like surgical gloves or protective garments. Moving to the renewable ecosystem, products such as photovoltaic cells, when everybody wants to install solar panels to become more energy independent and green. There we are heavily dependent on China, as you may know. Also products such as LED lamps are an import where we don't have much domestic production. Moving to the digital ecosystems, and I'm not going to read out 204 products, but to give you a good idea of what we're talking about. Laptops, mobile phones, monitors, projectors, these are things where we heavily depend on third countries, and not any third countries, but 1 or 2. And finally, there were defense applications which ended on this list. Watches for rough movement, space navigation, aeronautical navigation, or even electric generators. Then, of course, the other interesting thing is if we are dependent on 1 or 2 suppliers, are these suppliers our close allies and trade partners, or are these countries with which the relationship is riskier? Looking at the overall picture among these roughly 200 products, most of the dependencies are with China. Counting as product numbers, about 31% of the 200 products, so roughly 60 of the 200 products are imported mostly from China. The second source is the United States, and the third one, Russia, with 7% of the products. Russia, however, only counts for 3% in terms of the import value of the strategically dependent products. So that was our exercise on what we identify. Now, with the economic security communication, the Commission has launched a second risk assessment exercise from a slightly different angle, not looking at economic dependencies as such, but only things which are about our security. So, for example, dual-use goods, which could be used for military purposes. Looking at risks where third countries could weaponize our economic dependencies. There, under the economic security exercise, which still needs to start, it has been announced last week, the Commission will look at 4 types of risks. Risks to supply chains under the security definition, but also risks to critical infrastructure, risks to technology security, and risks of economic coercion by third countries. The responses, once the risks have been identified, once the most critical technologies have been identified, will first be to promote our own competitiveness, promote technologies. And this is also very much about investing in research, investing in innovation in the EU. We have several EU funds in place. The Commission has proposed to blend resources and use together the funds that we have, and if member states so agree, have a bit more money to put in place something called Strategic Technologies for Europe platform, STEP in short, which would allow us to finance our competitiveness investments. In this 3-pronged approach, the second P stands for protecting our data, protecting our technologies. And this means being careful about what technologies are exported, research security, including participation of third countries in EU research programs, or protection of very sensitive intellectual property. And finally, the third P is about partnership, working with our allies across the world and starting with the most like-minded countries. Closer cooperation with G7, which has already started work on looking at critical dependencies and how to respond to them jointly. But also working with the United States, in particular under the auspices of the existing Trade and Technology Council. Working with India, with which we have also created a Trade and Technology Council. Moving from security to a broader picture of what is done for the economic security overall. The supply chains, of which I gave you many examples of dependencies. There also we are working with third countries. The EU remains an open economy. We are building strategic partnerships in areas such as raw materials. Resource-rich countries in Africa, Latin America, but also countries like Canada and Australia are our partners for getting access to raw materials which we need, in particular for the green and digital transition. Closing free trade agreements with further partners across the globe. And in this, avoiding competition where all our partners would be competing and bidding each other out in the race for access to raw materials or critical ingredients for medicine. Other elements of our supply chain strategy, they include improving our regulatory system, and this may mean easier permitting procedures, easier conditions for investors which want to set up production facilities in the EU. seeing what can be done to improve access to finance from the EU funds, seeing how to work together with the member states to improve the availability of skills which are needed for developing strategic industries in the EU. There have been many specific initiatives under the heading of supply chains, starting with the CHIPS Act of last year, how to ensure better access through trade partnerships, through development in the EU of the chips industry, through work with our partners like the United States. Under the health emergencies, there is now an institution in place which is the Health Emergency Response and Anticipation, or HERA. And more recently, the Commission put forward a proposal for Critical Raw Materials Act. But finally, coming back to the backbone of our economy, the single market. The single market is open to the rest of the world. Our trade inside the EU in the last 30 years has doubled, but also our trade with third countries has doubled relative to GDP. We remain open, and this gives us power to negotiate in the geopolitical context, but it also means that what happens in the single market is critical for our domestic industries. After the pandemic, we put in place a proposal, which is still with the co-legislators, called a Single Market Emergency Instrument. And this would be an instrument for crisis, learning from the pandemic, but learning from floods, volcano eruptions, terrorist attacks, and having seen how member states, in some cases, in the first panic and not knowing exactly what the emergency was about, were very quickly to close their borders. There were many export bans within the single market. Availability of information of border controls during the pandemic was not optimal. And we have made proposals to improve information exchange, ban things like export prohibitions inside the single market. We have proposed even preparedness measures like strategic stockpiling by the member states. This would be a critical step for our preparedness for the next crisis and for our supply chains, and there we will see what comes out of the Council and Parliament once negotiations end. So I would stop here with this happy remark of single market at 30 years being the backbone for our open strategic autonomy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I could not have guessed how much I benefited from stepping in for Andrea. We will be starting to work on elements of stress testing supply chains soon. So there are many questions that we have considered, but you have given already many answers. So the question is whether there is a more general context. Should there be a limit to the expansion of trade with third countries that we still observe that is going on and happening? Is there a risk by thinking about security that we slip into a neo-mercantilist mode of feeling that everything has to be produced at home, or at least 200 goods, and we only worry about export controls? And is it that there should be a concern about who is a like-minded partner, and should there be a negotiated relationship to coalitions, to forming coalitions or in bilateral relations, rather than reliance on rules that hold for everybody? And the question is also, who is a like-minded partner? The Canadians wouldn't have thought what happened to them with the partner in a free trade agreement when there were security concerns voiced against them. So these are very pressing questions for people who discuss economic security. And I would like to give the word to the panel. Cinzia will be the first person to speak from the panel.
Thank you very much. So I would like to start exactly from the last point that you made, Andreas, and maybe actually taking a step back on my personal experience. I did my studies in international macroeconomics in Geneva some 20 years ago, quite a long time ago. And at that time, Geneva was the headquarters of all international organizations. We were really at the highest level of multilateralism. So I come with a background which is very much based on multilateralism and openness. And what I realized in the last 3-4 years is that the change in the narrative about trade and openness has changed basically 180 degrees. And what was called economic integration now is called exposure or vulnerability. I mean, we are basically calling with a different name the same kind of indicators. So this is really a shift in the narrative. And basically, when I look at all the issue of strategic autonomy, which I understand perfectly the concerns, I also wonder to what extent this new narrative basically implies reducing openness and basically ending up in a situation where a trade integration is not anymore an objective, is not a usual tool, let's say, that the EU has to define its role in the global world. Because we need to realize that if we take measures which are inward-looking, measures which to some extent reduce our openness, we contribute to define a world which is more divided. The EU is one of the key global traders. The measure that we will take will affect the global order and a possible deviation from a multilateral system which is rule-based. So the more we go in the direction, as Andrea said, of like-minded procedure or creation and coalition, this will actually contribute to create a fragmented world, which is the very outcome that we want to avoid because the prosperity of the EU was based on a rule-based system. So I think this is a quite fundamental issue that we need to consider. And in a more forward-looking perspective, I think there is also another element. Unless we want to become a military power, which I doubt we have the tools in any case, I think that trade remains the main tool for defining our actorness. And given that the economic weight of the EU will decline, we like it or not, because of the rise of other powers, this is, in relative terms, this is inevitable. Again, if you become smaller and you've become closer, the way to affirm yourself in the global scene will be reduced, will be hampered. So these are big questions, but I think are also issues that we really need to keep in mind when we define what EU strategic autonomy is, and when we define the scope, if you want, or the perimeter of what is strategic and the 204 products or the broad sectors which define what strategic is. I will stop here for the moment.
Thank you very much. And Thomas will be the second speaker from the panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for the contribution we heard, and thanks for your interest coming here tonight. Let me pick up where Cinzia left. You called it a shift of narrative. I think what we are observing is maybe even more than that. It might be a paradigm shift, because we've all, as you described properly, and I'm coming from the same kind of educational background. We've all been, happily relying on a global system, which gave us security. We believed in more trade means spreading democracy over the world. Developing richness in every country in the world, and comparative advantages can be used, and everything is just better off in the end. So we all know that story, but it seems to be kind of over. I think this is what we're discussing, and we have to, I think this is why this project is also very valuable. We have to be a bit careful, obviously. Yeah? We shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, obviously, but carefully analyze where we are and where the risks are, and where we see maybe a trade-off by re-evaluating our trade chains. And since I'm coming from the Council Secretariat, I would want to share, and I come from the ECOFIN, so the economic and financial policy area. I would like to share with you just highlight some issues which are today discussed in the Council between the 27 member states, regularly, of course, based on Commission proposals like the one Auti has just outlined to us. So on the one hand, as I said, one might look at what we are facing and what we see developing in front of us, with us in the middle or a little bit at the border, maybe, I don't know, as a paradigm shift. There's also quite some things which we have always been having in our policies. So it's not all new. Also in the financial and economic area, we also did some assessments. But that's not so radical and not so new. It comprises, for example, do we have the right infrastructures in our internal market? And I'm coming directly to financial services. So can we do our financial services? Can we have our integrated market in that area when we do not have strategic infrastructure, like, for example, some clearing institutions for certain financial transactions in the European Union? So that's a question which came up pretty early with the Brexit, actually, yeah? Because when the Brits were happily in the internal market, everybody was also happy to have the infrastructures they provided in London. Now they're just a third country, and third countries might have their own interests, and they do. And the Brits are no exemption to that. So we developed in the financial services area a list of strategic infrastructures which we needed. I mentioned clearing institutions. But we also forced, let's say, banks when they exercise full banking activities in our internal market, to have a license here in the EU, and not just say, look, we're from the British Island, and so why don't we have the right to exercise our full business in your internal market as we did before? No, the reason is because you left. So now people really have to apply for banking licenses, and banks who are in Great Britain, they can be in Great Britain and still do business in the internal market, but they have to register a fully fledged company, a subsidiary of their bank, in the internal market. So these kind of infrastructure things are ongoing and are, I think, very much in line with the ideas of, how can we be more autonomous in a strategic way. The development of things like a digital euro is also an initiative which I might mention here. But then, I mean, these are infrastructure and very strategic reflections. But then there's also some normality in policies by just continuing by what we've been working on for quite a while, maybe with a better understanding how important it is to achieve these goals. And I stay for a moment with the financial markets. There is, like, for example, the Capital Markets Union as one buzzword, which is about how to develop capital markets in Europe to give investors, when they need money, especially younger companies, access to a different source than just the bank, because the bank is maybe willing to finance a startup company when they're small and they just need a little flat whatever. But when they go into their growth period, when they are successful, the bank will ask for securities, for assets, to put against a large loan which these companies would then need. And of course, such a company doesn't have any assets because they're just developing into a market. And this is what normally then takes them off the banking system for financing. They look for capital on the capital market. They don't find this very often in Europe, and then they land in America because they get this capital. And we have, unfortunately, a large number of concrete examples where very promising young firms went off to America to get financing for their growth period. When they were successful, when they are successful, normally they stay there. So here is something we need to do. We need to develop this capital market. Nodding in this room, I see. There's also nodding even in the European Council on these issues. Now we just need to do it. Obviously not so easy, but here's one ongoing subject from the ECOFIN files, which fits, I think, very well in this kind of new narrative. So we've also investing a lot of work in making our banking sector more resilient. These are consequences we drew from the last financial crisis. So also in a way ongoing business, but still again very helpful if really pursued for our strategic autonomy. For example, last night there was but there was an agreement between the Council and the European Parliament on Basel III capital standards for bank. Finally. So that is one of the things which move forward. The payment system is something where we all rely, unfortunately, very heavily on American structures. Our Visa cards, the MasterCards, the Google Pay, all this stuff. None of this is European. It works well until it works well, or until it doesn't work well anymore. So, some banks are pursuing a payment initiative to come up with a solution there, but it's not really where it should be. So there's another project there. I switch a bit topic and come to fiscal policy. So that's budgetary policy, which is coordinated between the member states in the monetary union and also in the internal market. And here, of course, the challenge is to finance quite a number of investments. And Auti has mentioned some of them, defense and digital transition and all of that. So lots of public investments will be needed. But at the same time, the challenge is to not overstretch the fiscal possibility of the states. Because we do not want to land in another public debt crisis because we were happily financing whatever came along. But then finally, financial markets might withdraw their confidence to European member states. So the fiscal strength, therefore, is an element of strategic autonomy because you are less reliant on rating agencies, the goodwill of international finance investors, etc. The stronger you are, the better is your position there. Fiscal policy coordination these days has to do also with coordination with what the European Central Bank does, which is all about bringing the inflation down. Because, you learn or I learned at least in university in one of the first semesters that there is something like price competitiveness. So if our single market had constantly a higher inflation rate than other trading partners, then we would lose over time competitiveness because what we can buy with our euro is becoming less and less worth year by year. So we have to bring down the inflation also from that side, apart from all the internal economics which lead to this reflection also. So there's a coordination effort here to do, and we shouldn't have public spending standing on the accelerator to create growth or to invest here and there and everywhere. And on the other side, having the central bank stepping on the brake because they say, wait a minute, I mean, if we have to bring down the growth of demand to control inflation. So obviously a coordination here is needed. And this is also something which is happening, for example, in the Eurogroup, and the ministers from the Euro countries meet with the central bank once a month, like last week. So I think these were some examples where like ongoing policy can contribute to a landscape of a well-done reflection, analysis of risks, and a reflection towards strategic autonomy. So I think in the end, what we need to avoid in this area is, as I said, creating debt problems. Public debt crisis would be the last of the thing which a more strategically independent European Union would need. And we also need to avoid on that way, as I said, a conflict between the central bank and the finance ministries of the member state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with this, I give the word to the last speaker, Livio, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I have to admit that I have a quite different background from what Cinzia had. I mean, I'm a more industrial economist, so I will look at the same topic from a slightly different perspective, at least apparently. So I agree with Thomas. The events of the last years at the global level have forced Europe, I think, to change, to rethink its approach to competitiveness. So in a way, it was not something that Europe could avoid to do, given what was happening at the global level. And what I see is a fast moving from an approach that I would call a regulatory state approach that we all know, so where public institutions fix the rule and then let market signals to decide what is the development path of firms and industries, towards something like a development state approach, meaning that public institution tries to also, in a way, force from a macro and micro level the development paths, okay? So with some sort of economic planning. Now, this change in approach, which I see, and I think it's occurring, is not something new for Europe. If we look at our history after the Second World War, we had decades where national governments actively promoted the building of industrial capacity in sectors that were deemed to be strategic for the national governments at that time. We have, of course, all in mind Airbus example, but there are many other examples of that heritage that still plays a role today. Just a few examples. If you look at Sicily in this year and the next year will be targeted by huge investment in the solar panel industry and also in the micro chip industry with a gigafactory near Catania. Both these investments did not come out of the blue. Actually, they are the heritage of decisions undertaken by the Italian government back to the 60s of the previous century. So just to give you a sense that this change to a more proactive role of the state is not something that Europe has never experienced before. The second comment is that this change in approach, in fact, aligns Europe to what our competitors are doing. So in a way, it's also a reaction to active industrial policies which have been promoted since a long time by our competitors. I think in particular to Eastern Asia, but not just to China. We all know and we all speak about China, but the success of Japan and the success of Korea, which together with China represent the most powerful technological producers in the world, they are all countries with stringent and active industrial policies. But there is a fundamental difference from what is the current scenario Europe is facing and what this previous and other success story, if you want, of industrialization are. And the difference is that we now face a context of global competition. That was not the case when Japan, Korea, or even China led their industrial strategies. So this means that when domestic national industries were promoted and supported actively in those countries, they were largely insulated from import competition. And this also means that when incentives were given to local producers with demand-side incentives, they were largely absorbed by domestic producers and not by foreign producers. Now, this fact, I stress this point because I think this highlights one of the two open issues in the open strategic autonomy strategy of Europe, which I still see nowadays. And in particular, the many initiatives that have been launched in the last couple of years or reshaped under the Green Deal Industrial Plan, make important contributions on many aspects, like in terms of geological problem of scarcity of raw materials. They also made important contribution in terms of technology, technological upgrade of our productions, but I think they neglect a competitiveness problem of these EU productions, meaning that we have to admit that Europe nowadays is a laggard in many productions which are key for our twin transitions. There are other producers, in particular Chinese producers, able to offer in the international markets technological advanced products at low cost. And this is a constraint to our ability to produce, to make EU productions which are competitive in the foreign markets. So my question is, can we take for granted that all these EU initiatives to promote and to increase production of the EU in key technologies will match the demand of EU buyers, or even worse, extra EU buyers, given that alternatives already exist in the market? And if I think, for instance, of what is going on in the electric vehicle markets with a huge penetration of Chinese-produced cars, even in a market like Germany, which traditionally is more oriented towards German-branded cars, I think there are signals which are worrisome. So what to do? Of course, I have no clear answers, but I have a few suggestions, at least, of the direction. One is to make a more strategic use of public procurement, in a way similar to what Americans do since a long time. So use access to public demand as a means to support EU strategic production. Of course, this is done already in some sectors, like in the defense industry, but I think that it can be enlarged and made more effective for other production which are considered to be strategic. Second, we should leverage much more on the higher environmental standards of EU productions. EU products, on average, are less costly for the environment than what our competitors do. If we make this cost differential, environmental cost differential, explicit, this will increase the competitiveness of EU productions vis-a-vis non-EU productions. In a way, in other words, the cost differentials would shrink, and this would help the international competitiveness of the EU. The second issue I want to raise regards a dimension of critical dependencies, which again I think it has been a bit neglected in the current analysis. So we focus, and we do have to focus on bottlenecks in terms of supply chains. So importance to have raw materials and other inputs for the European downstream producers. This, if you want, is critical dependencies from the supply side, but we have also a dimension of critical dependence on the demand side. If we rely too much on exports to jurisdictions which may use protectionist policies at the expense of EU producers, then we would have a demand shock to the European value chains, which can be as critical as supply shocks on the supply chains. If we look in particular today at the ratio between EU export and value added in manufacturing, so what is the importance of EU exports for the value added produced by EU manufacturing, then the European value is 25% higher than in China and 51 percentage points higher than in the US. The same ratio, if you look at extra EU exports, and we compare the same ratio for the US or China, we see that we are much more unbalanced in our reliance on export markets as compared to the US and China. And this highly asymmetric dependence, I think, weakens our soft power, or if you want, our bargaining power when it comes to discuss with China or the US new trade agreements. So just to say that at the risking strategy for Europe should also look at ways to safeguard European value chains from demand-side shocks and not only from supply-side ones. How to do that? The most obvious way, I think, beside looking for the diversification of export markets, which of course is a strategy, is to revive the EU internal demand, so the EU single market, reviving both private consumption and public consumption. In many countries, the internal demand component has been stagnant for more than a decade. And I think that by reviving internal demand, we can reduce the risk based on the excessive reliance on exports. And of course, this calls for a reconsideration of macroeconomic policies, starting from the Stability and Growth Pact, which is under discussion. It's important that we improve labor market outcomes, reducing inactive population, increasing real wages, increasing worker skills, complete the capital market union, and finally, we should also contrast effectively the decline in the European population. Just to conclude, and all in all, I would say that the current scenario poses a threat to defend against for our economy, also our security, but is also an opportunity to rethink our approach to development. As long as we are able, and I would say also willing, to manage the complexity of the many complementary changes that are requested. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Livio. Before I give the floor to the audience, I would give the first Uti and then the panelists a chance to react to what you have heard. So, Uti.
Thank you very much. A very interesting discussion. Great to be here. I try to be restricted in my comments because there are a lot of things I would like to say already to react to that. But maybe starting with a comment that we all learned the theory of comparative advantage during our studies, and it's changing now. But one thing which has changed is that the basic theory of comparative advantage would tell companies to buy from the cheapest source, so import from one country which sells at lowest cost, and lean production, don't keep any excessive stocks because they all have a cost in terms of capital. But what the reality is that there are always risks and they have to be priced in. This, in the simplest version of comparative advantage, you don't take into account that maybe you have stocks for 1 or 2 weeks to continue your production, and all your new inputs are in a boat which just got stuck in the Suez Canal because there was another boat which blocked the canal, and then you have to wait for 2 months before you get anything to produce on. So not holding stocks and only buying from one country or one company if there is a risk that maybe the Chinese factory is closed because there is a new pandemic which leads to a lockdown. This has a cost, and it also has a good, healthy side on the economy that the economic actors, not only governments but also businesses, have realized this. Maybe it has been hard learning through the pandemic, but there is much more pricing in of a risk now. Then the second very interesting thing, Cynthia, you spoke about what used to be called integration of positive sense now having become the very negative phenomenon of exposure. And Livia, you said basically the same thing. If we depend on export markets, it makes us vulnerable. So if we export less, then we are safer and we have fewer risks. But there, of course, at least the way I see the realities is that we don't improve welfare by becoming a closed economy. There are a lot of things which we need, like many raw materials which simply do not exist in the EU. We need the imports. There are no substitutes, at least in the short term. And trading more, but diversifying our sources more is the way. So rather than saying, let's put a limit to overall imports into the EU and start exporting and importing less, instead of that, let's diversify our trade relations even more than we have done. I quoted some of the figures, and of our critical dependencies, more than 50% are with China, so diversification would be the way forward. And of course, if there is a risk of being vulnerable to trade attacks by third countries, let's not forget that we do not only export, but we also import. We also have a power to take trade measures if there is a trade issue. We are the largest export market to 80 countries worldwide, which also gives us power. And the final thing I wanted to say in this round is that indeed there are many good ways of using our economic weight in the world. And one of them is trying to prevent a subsidy race, which we sometimes see. We published, I would never leave unused a good moment to advertise all the Commission publications, but in our annual single market report in February, we published a very thick annex, which is a review of some of the key resilience measures taken in third countries. And it's not only the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act or Buy America. It's not only China with Made in China policy. It's Korea, Japan with economic resilience laws, government entities, strategic stockpiling by the governments of critical raw materials. It's the UK, Australia with resilience plans. And we are in this new geopolitical context. No matter whether we asked for it or not, we are in that, and we have to see what to do. And one very useful thing to do is to try to prevent a global subsidy race for investments and try to see how we can revive at least some parts of the multilateral trading system, including the WTO. And another very important thing which the Commission as a big trade actor is doing is to look at our environmental norms, our human rights norms, and impose them also on our trade partners. There is a Commission proposal to ban forced labor, which also would apply, once approved by the co-legislator, to imports from third countries. There is another Commission proposal being discussed on corporate sustainable due diligence, which would impose on all companies, also third country companies, which have significant operations in the EU, the human rights and climate obligations. The Commission has put forward a proposal on a carbon border adjustment mechanism to make sure that we don't become an exporter of industries to third countries, but we play on a level playing field. So this is another very important way to use our global economic weight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uti. And Cinzia?
Just very quickly, I would like to highlight two points which were mentioned. So the first one is really diversification. When we look at the strategy which are possible in order to achieve strategic autonomy, first one is diversification. And I think, Oti, you said it rightly. I mean, to some extent, this is part of the risk management that companies should do. So the reassessment of global risks could actually lead companies to change their attitude and where production takes place and having stocks, larger stocks than basically before the COVID crisis. So in a sense, there is a part which is market-driven. This is based just on incentive and assessment of the risks. The story becomes more complicated when these risks are perceived in a different way by companies and by governments. And there the risk is really of falling into the subsidy strategies. Because if you want companies to relocate or to have different partners, you may need to give the right incentives. And that is really where it becomes more complicated. And in fact, there is a lot of speaking about friendshoring, nearshoring, reshoring, all these different words which have become very common, which really refer to relocation of production. And one of the strategies whether production should be brought back home. This is also what Livio mentioned. And there, the tricky part is really that an efficient allocation of resources. So are we good at producing certain goods? And this may not be the case simply because in the past certain kinds of production were taking place elsewhere. And this may require a public intervention. And there the question is whether maybe countries, member states, which have pockets with different depth, let's say, they can support national industries and national companies in a different way, which may lead to an unlevel playing field for companies, which would have an impact on the single market. So these are questions which remains open and I think should be addressed because they have an EU dimension and a country dimension affecting also development strategy and national industrial strategy other than the EU approach. I will stop it here, otherwise it's getting too late.
Thank you very much. And Thomas, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just two little remarks. One is on what Livio said. He said one of the elements he said was using strategically public procurement. And this maybe today would lead to a large nodding everywhere. Yes, of course, why didn't we do that before? But when we constructed the single market, I was quite some decades ago working in the Commission on opening up public procurement market, because then the narrative obviously was, this is totally inefficient, because what the state buys is all from friends and cousins and, you know, this kind of thing. And of course, this is never best value for money for the taxpayers who pay the bill. So this is an illustration. I don't criticize what you say, but it's an illustration of how much a paradigm shift we are just living through. And I think we need a lot of analysis, like the one, like the elements Auti has mentioned, to not overshoot and to do the right thing and find the right path. Because obviously, and this is my second remark, what we have seen during the pandemic were very negative wealth effects, because we did not have these masks, we did not have other things which we desperately needed and everybody also needed in the pandemic. So we paid a very, very high price for this. I mean, we didn't have any relation to the production costs anymore, what we paid in Europe and elsewhere also for these masks and other things. So this has a cost because we relied on international trade and everything being available all the time, everywhere. But if we then say, okay, now we need to produce things which we do not produce today anymore in Europe because we are more costly in the production, then this would also have a negative wealth effect, because we've all become accustomed to quite some cheap and very nice products, which will of course be more expensive if we start producing the chips and some other elements which are implemented in these goods here in Europe. Of course they will. So there are wealth effects, and all I'm saying is we need to really go the way the Commission proposed, which is analyzing properly what we're doing and where we need to act before acting and just throwing everything overboard, because how could we ever have done it like this is maybe the way we tend to look at it today, but there's maybe more to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last words for Livio.
Just in a nutshell, I agree with you. I mean, there are risks. We have to, study, and before acting, we have to really be wise in selecting what are the trade-offs we want to face. I think that to reduce the risks of failure of this strategy, one one issue is the administrative capacity that we really need, because these policies, all these initiatives that have been launched, and I also think about the resilience facility that we are managing, for instance, in Italy, so huge investments, but they requires really the capacity by the public institutions to understand the complexity and design properly the measures. And this is something that at least I have the example of the country like Italy is a constraint, in fact, to achieve what are the goals that the EU is pursuing. So this is one of the issues that it takes time, unfortunately, to build a new administrative capacity, but this is a precondition for, I think, the success of our strategy.
Thank you very much for this interesting and deep discussion. I will be forgiven for giving 5 minutes to the floor, or 10 minutes, let's say. Are there questions from the floor? Please. Thank you. Maybe I collect other questions before we give the opportunity to answer. Yes, over there first, and then here.
On the same issue as the previous question, both questions like-minded, with whom we may or may not cooperate. Two particular cases. One of them, the United Kingdom, where effectively a third country emerging from their own stock building crisis, and which is unable to finalize a deal on the famous Horizon program, which seems to me is very germane to what we're talking about here. Is it reliable? And for instance, another country like Turkey, as a candidate country. Would we wish, in fact, to include candidate countries, including places like Turkey, in this list? If so, how? Final question, what impact has all this going to have on our relations with the WTO? And for that matter, a likely impact on the future of the WTO itself, a very wobbly institution.
Thank you. There were two more questions. Yes?
Hi.
And then here.
My name is Alberto Ferrigno. I am a policy advisor to corporations, NGOs on the Green Deal. I really appreciate you mentioning about the paradigm shift, which is true. We are in a paradigm shift, but I think nobody mentioned the high energy costs that we are now facing in using wind. Just to give you an example, over the past 2 weeks, 300
Thank you. And the last question from the
My
gentleman.
name is Wienand Patries from the Dutch Confederation of Industries. I wanted to ask a question built on the remarks made on the change of paradigm and the change of narrative. Because sometimes I'm wondering whether we take sufficiently into account how different the economic narrative and the geopolitical narrative are. Not the narrative, but the logic. And that the economy, international economy we live in today is so much influenced by geopolitical thinking, which is completely at odds with economic thinking, that from an economic point of view, we should much more take into account how bizarre this geopolitical thinking is, but it is a reality. And when you think about economic phenomena, we must be more aware that, for example, a number of countries in the world, I think now, are really very aggressively looking at the EU and trying to influence the EU. And they are certainly not afraid of using all kinds of blackmailing policies. And I feel it's not sufficiently yet taken into account in the economic narrative that really things are very different. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Who wants to go first? I think, yes, Cinzia?
Okay, I will try to react to the first and then the last question. On the first question, I completely agree with you. I also have the impression that we have somehow a double narrative when it comes to the United States. On the one hand, it's our ally, historical ally, and our closeness to the thinking. It's clear. But on the other side, also the political uncertainty about the US. We don't know what will happen basically next year when there will be elections and whether we will have Trump or another kind of Trump. But I think we're also all realizing that despite the color of the new US administrations, some elements have really changed in the US approach when it comes to its positioning in the global economy and vis-a-vis China. And basically the rivalry with China is the key defining element of US politics. So I think this is a point which needs to be taken from the European side, and I think it's the main driver of the second logic, of the second narrative, that despite it's our main ally, we need to define our strategic role in an independent way. So we can't just rely completely on the United States. On the last point, I completely agree with you. The geopolitics logic is dominated by power. It's about being assertive on the global scene, following the logic of power, not anymore the economic power. And this is basically what is challenging the rule-based system. It's a power-based system. And for Europe, it's an issue. We are not an assertive power like China or the United States. So this makes basically our position very complicated. And I agree with you that we need to take into consideration this change, also when we make our economic considerations. But I think it becomes very difficult to play on that kind of ground.
Thank you, Cinzia. Anybody on the, yes, Uti?
Okay, maybe I take it up where Cinzia ended. Indeed, I also fully agree with you that looking at the geopolitics, they didn't do the same economics courses as we did. But of course, we live in the world which is imperfect and not the first best. But on what you said of the awareness of third countries maybe having evil thoughts or blackmailing policies, I would like to come back to what I said about the economic security work which the Commission is starting, because from my perspective this is exactly about looking at risks of third countries weaponizing our economic dependencies. And the idea is very much to pay more attention, assess the risks and see what the right instruments are. So I believe that if the topic has not been very much on the agenda, in some maybe your view, at least now it is very much on the agenda. On multilateralism, the WTO position, the Commission and the EU as a WTO member is very much hoping that the WTO would again be revived. There are many members which currently are not active. The WTO is now weaker than it has been. The EU alone cannot change it, but of course the EU is on the global arena the player which is used to being a rules-based actor which wants to work in a rules-based world economic order. And with the UK, Turkey, of course, close cooperation is in anybody's interest. The United States clearly is an ally. It is not a country to be careful with. We have very close relations with the United States. The Inflation Reduction Act has elements which are not positive. The good thing is that it is about a climate agenda in the United States. Elements which we believe are not good for our relationship are being negotiated. There are people who are talking to the US in order to find solutions, but the US is clearly a very close ally. On high energy costs, yes, it is an issue. We are coming out of a very serious energy crisis in the EU, which didn't start but got much worse after the brutal Russian aggression in Ukraine. We are struggling to become more independent in terms of energy while moving to more renewable energy sources, and this all is costly. There have been a lot of subsidies, there has been support to companies, to households, but clearly the climate agenda and the desire to become independent of Russian energy and more independent in energy overall has a cost.
Thank you very much, Oti. And Thomas.
Thank you very much for these questions. I think on the US-EU issue, I don't see at all a conflict in describing the US as a friendly partner, I would say, but still making our own points very clearly. So it's not like, you negotiate with your parents in a family or something, but we have to make we have to negotiate from a strong position. Just one little example. My understanding is, I hope it's not wrong, had we concluded the trade deal with the Americans, which was on the table some years ago, the whole Inflation Reduction Act problems would not be there, because it would all be regulated in there. And so we would have the access to the US market ensured by this trade agreement. But we didn't. And I mean, the country where I come from, one of the main reasons really to be against this trade deal was that the Americans have a habit of dumping dead chickens into some clarified water to purify them or whatever, and Germans found this extremely ugly. So we didn't support this trade deal, and that's one of the big reasons. It's completely ridiculous. So if we want to play an international role, if we want to be an autonomous party in a new global setting in the world, then we need to overcome this stuff. I mean, if we continue to overcharge trade agreements with whatever we find very nice to have, then we will never sign any more trade agreements anymore. I mean, you remember that the Canadian Prime Minister traveled to Belgium, more concretely to La Wallonie, to convince a regional parliament that the Canadians were quite friendly people after all, and could be taken even seriously as a trade partner. So we have to get out of this kind of habit. I think that's the answer. Huh? So we will have friends. I mean, You know, coming from Germany, I know that our French friends, which are best friends, obviously, that doesn't mean that we agree on anything in the first place. You have to fight about positions, but you have to do that from a very firm point of view. And I don't think in the past we've done that. For me, that is also part of this strategic autonomy agenda. And my second remark is also on the energy cost. Auti, you mentioned the fiscal support which has been given, and to a large extent, a deficit finance from budgets to avoid that households in the first place have to suffer from this explosive increases in gas prices and other energy prices we saw. Quite some money has also been spent to help industry in this period, obviously. So there was some, I mean, it wasn't mentioned here, you're right. Sorry, but we would have needed another hour maybe to cover all the subjects which this enshrines. But actions have been taken on the fiscal side. And one action which needs to be taken is continued work on an energy market in the European Union. Because, I mean, I get on a weekly basis a graph from my colleagues which shows the electricity price in all the member states on a weekly basis. So it's a daily. If you look at when I looked first at this map, I couldn't believe my eyes because there were differences between the member states, like 300%. Same thing like electricity, right? And then it became even worse because next week I looked at the same charts in an updated version. There were still the same discrepancies, but they had completely changed. Those who had access to cheap electricity last week now were suffering from very high. And even for countries very close to each other, like Finland and Sweden, or, you know, let's not talk about France and Spain for obvious reasons, but there's no, the exchange structures which you need to allow cheap energy when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining from some areas to some other areas where it's covered skies, don't function. So we have invested over more than 50 years in the internal market tons of money on structural funds to build highways and sometimes even very good things. But we forgot these strategic infrastructure questions like the energy market. And this, of course, is an issue. It's, of course, is an issue. Otherwise, this will not go away. I mean, I don't say that this is an easy answer and this will then go away in 6 months. If only people understood, it's much longer. But here's another issue for strategic autonomy and for strategic infrastructure, which we urgently need to understand that this is an issue and then get our hands on.
Thank you very much. Leave you with the last
1 minute, less than 1 minute. Just a general comment, both regarding US-EU relationship, but also the energy cost. I think that in both cases, both when it comes to geopolitical relationship with our partners or competitors, and when it comes to deal with the energy crisis, the important thing is to keep a unique voice at the EU level, and so to react as a community which has a single objective, which is the one of the EU, and not that of the single member states. I think that both when it comes to the member state relation with the US and China, and when it comes to the energy crisis, one of the weaknesses we have experienced in the last years is that we didn't have a strategy at the EU level. But still, we see member states moving individually. They try to negotiate directly with the Chinese president, or they go to the United States and they try to make good deals for their own companies. This is what we should try to avoid. And the same, of course, happened with the energy crisis. But we all know that every country before the burst of the Ukraine war had actually energy, a national strategy for energy supply. So I think that the response to all these challenges require a unified approach at the EU level.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, the time is over. This was a very good discussion, and I'm sure it could go on for a while, but we are already 20 minutes over time. And thank you very much for your contributions. It was very interesting and very deep. And thank you for your attention, and see you at the 5th CDP CEPS meeting. Thank you.
Just to say, for those who can stay, there is some food and some drinks just downstairs. It's deserved after 20 minutes overtime.